So, this is a timeline. This is your life. Here is your birth. And here is when you see Jesus face to face. You stand before him and he rewards you based upon how you managed the time given to you. Now, this is you in the present. And as you could imagine, there are so many paths that we can take in life. And so, is there any way to know which path is the best path for your purpose? Because when we see Jesus, we want for him to be pleased with how we worked for him and how we lived. We want to hear, "Well done." So how do you make sure that you take the right path? Well, there is really only one way to make sure that you travel the right path in your timeline, and it is to know the creator of your timeline. You see, we often wonder if God sees into the future. Well, it's not that God sees into the future as if he's looking at it from our point of view. God is outside of the timeline that we are within, because he is the creator of timelines. But thankfully, when we have faith in Jesus, something amazing happens. He allows his spirit to enter time, to enter our timeline, to guide us to a good path that he has already mapped out. So that when we do see him, we will hear, "Well done." Okay, let me put it another way. The Bible says God is the author of life. And so it's almost as if God has written a book, and he is the author of the book, and we are characters within the book. Notice what Psalms 139 reads: "All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be." You see, the psalmist knew that God's perspective of time is a bit different from ours. We are characters within the book that he wrote before time even began. I'll put it another way. Before God begins something, he first writes it out, he decrees it, and then he starts it. Notice what God says through the prophet Isaiah: "I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times, what is still to come. I say my purpose will stand, and I will do all that I please." You see, from God's perspective, everything is already done. Everything is already complete. We are the ones who are characters within the story or timeline that God has already written. And so the point I am making is this: you don't have to wonder if you will reach your purpose when you follow the path God has written for you. God has an ordained purpose for everything. He has a written plan for our universe. He has a plan for our earth. And he has a purpose and plan for you. And the amazing thing is, for those who choose him and who choose to follow him, God has ordained for you a good plan. And that's so important for us to understand. The plan he has for us is a good one if we choose to follow him. Romans 8:28. Look what Paul says. "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." When you love God, he works for your good. And that good is always in accordance with his purpose. Now, someone may ask, if God has a purpose and a plan for everything, and if he has ordained for everything to work out in a certain way, well, does that mean that there's no free will? Great question. Well, I would say, even though you do have a good destiny that is determined and planned by God, the fulfillment of that good destiny is decided by you. Okay, for example, the Pharisees. We know that they were far from following God. I mean, they had his son crucified. So they were not hearing him, and they certainly weren't following him. And in Luke chapter 7, Jesus was teaching about John the Baptist. And some people believed his words. And of course, the Pharisees did not. And so look at what it says. But the Pharisees and the experts in the law rejected God's purpose for themselves because they had not been baptized by John. And so because they refused to follow John and be baptized, and they refused to acknowledge Jesus, it says they ended up what? Rejecting God's purpose for themselves. That's huge, because that means that a person can reject God's purpose. Because here we see that God even had a good purpose for the Pharisees, but they chose a different path. And that path led to the crucifixion of his son, which is great for us. I mean, hey, we have salvation, but it was not good for the Pharisees. And so, as you can see, God's ultimate purpose will always be fulfilled, because Jesus had to die, but they ended up being a part of God's purpose, but as the bad character in his story, because they didn't follow him. You see how that works? So yes, God has ordained everything, but he invites us to choose what character we will be in the story he has authored. Those who choose to follow God will arrive at a good place in God's story. Those who don't choose to follow him will arrive at a bad place in God's story. And so, yes, this is deep, because no matter what you choose, you can't escape God's story. You can't escape his book. We are all trapped within the timeline of God, but we can choose to be one of the good characters in his story, part of the good purpose. We can choose to end up at a good place in God's timeline. And so, for instance, when an atheist says that they don't want to follow God, they may feel as if they are free to do what they want, right? But they are still trapped within God's story. Because in God's book, he has written that there will be those in the end times who reject him and who will make fun of those who believe in him. And so, again, we get to choose who we will be in God's story. We get to choose if we are those who reject him or if we are the ones who accept him. We get to choose if we will be those who are making fun of the believers or if we are the believers. No one can escape the book of God. It's already written. And so, my plea to you is this. This day, choose life. Choose to be one of those who ends up at a good place in the story God has written.